Welcome back, y'all. We heard Stephen Quayle last time. He talked about AI and how that can be exploited by some bad forces out there. It was a phenomenal talk. Very, very awesome insight from that guy, always. And later, after 40 minutes or so in that video, we continued with this documentary called Electric Universe Theory. It wasn't called that, but it's about this theory that claims that the universe is electric. It's charged, and hence the gravitational fields can be explained, and they go how that can be so. And also, actually, the majority of the documentary is about the ancient people and cultures seeing in the sky electrical discharge between planets. It was pretty hectic in our past, per this theory. The skies were kind of chaotic. I think maybe Venus flew in, Saturn was closer, it served as a main sun. Or not as a main sun, but as a bigger object out there that also emits some heat. So the Earth's heat was probably higher and things like that. But anyway, they do a really great job in explaining how some of the pictographs or some of the cave art from our ancient past, it correlates with the shapes from the electrical discharge that may have happened between the planets. So we saw that, we started seeing that in our last video, but we're gonna do it now again. All right, here it is. You will be able to see the shapes in the documentary on instead of where the map is right now on the lower left side. So that's where I'm gonna add this guy. You're welcome. All right, enjoy. Oh, by the way, I'm playing Civilization 3 on a really big map, so let's see what's gonna happen if I can, survive. See ya!
As Ta, equated with the god Geb. But in the absence of anything presently observed in the sky, the translators render the upper region of the sphere as heaven and the lower region as earth, introducing contradictions that could only confuse these Egyptian concepts. For any reliable interpretation, the reference must be considered in their archetypal, original, and testable contexts. For us, the objective contexts mean concrete forms in the sky and concretely experienced natural events reconstructed from the deepest cross-cultural agreement. In fact, as we intend to show in the episodes to follow, every archetype relating to the so-called separation of heaven and earth will fall into place as predictable themes within the context of this reconstruction.
See the shape that you're seeing right now? In the background is Saturn. In the front, several bodies before they got rearranged in the position that they are today. So one of them is probably Mars in the middle. Behind it is probably Venus. So Mars is the child, is Tammuz, in the ancient mystical teachings. He was Mars. That's why he was so vicious and stuff like that. But Venus housed him, in a way, in her belly, because when Venus is behind him. And then the Venus has the rays, right? So, which goddess also had the rays, all right? And so in the background this looks like a crescent, but it's actually Saturn, when Saturn was closer. And that was, Saturn was Shemesh, and most likely after that was Nimrod,
represented by it and things like that. But let's continue.
As you follow these discourses, you can
See? Bro.
assess this testability for yourself as we continue surveying the entire panorama of ancient myths, symbols, and sacred practices. The most critical themes are, firstly, an original, undifferentiated condition or absence of form, and secondly, an emerging geometry of creation with specific regions above and below, and thirdly, a central role of the archetypal warrior hero as the cosmic pillar personified, and filling the role of the demiurge, a primeval power executing a divine or intelligent plan.
Satan.
Thus, the role of the cosmic warrior was paramount. The separation of above and below was, in fact, the warrior.
Look at that electrical discharge or plasma or whatever between Mars and Earth. The poles of the Earth.
God's first achievement.
And there's Venus in behind and then Saturn behind them. But look how it looks from the Earth. Hence you got this all kind of look like a mother goddess, you know.
Even before he had earned his title as warrior god. In our previous episode, we considered the Egyptian stories of creation. An original unity, named as the god Atum, gave way to a separation, a division into regions above and below.
There's that shape with the
But
hints.
lacking any concrete referent, most translators render the two regions vaguely as heaven and earth, or heaven resting on an ambiguous horizon, or twin-peaked mountain. Global variations on the ancient theme repeat this remarkable idea, and innumerable interpretations of the theme have been published in both popular and academic media.
All right.
Under the common interpretation, the ancient language itself is left permanently obscure, whereas in the most ancient sources, highly concrete forms and a spectacular shift in the cosmic environment are consistently emphasized. In this series of discourses, we follow a different line of interpretation. We connect ancient myths and global symbols to extraordinary formations in the sky. The so-called creation has long been misunderstood. Creation was a remembered event when visible powers revered as gods appeared to construct a vast habitation in the heavens.
Now look, there's no Christian dimension in there, but if there was one, I am willing to bet whatever, that this was a reflection of what was going in the higher dimensions. Because this kind of looks like Saturn was pushed and was not the main focus from Earth point of view, and so hence the Satan was cast down, or Satan was fighting with Michael and his angel, and he lost. That could be very much it from a Christian perspective.
In the language of the myths, an emergence occurred, a differentiation and clarification of form where no form previously existed. The language for the original condition typically emphasizes chaos, not in the usual meaning of that term today, but in the sense of dimness, fog or clouds, celestial waters, a pre-dawn glow. No implication of turbulence, no hint of conflict or wars of the gods, all of which came later. The first meaning of the word chaos was formless. In the Egyptian stories, the creator Atum was immersed in the boundless waters of the deep, originally inactive and lacking any distinctive form. Then in the acts of...
That's kind of also what the Bible says. The earth was shapeless and void and without shape, and God's spirit was hovering on the waters of the earth. So there's something there.
creation, he acquired external limbs through the explosive ejection of visible outflow, called words of power. The texts say the God gave birth to himself through this acquisition of external form. More specifically, as we've noted in our reconstruction of these events, this form was provided by the god's lower limbs, his resting place, his perch, the cosmic pillar. The pillar is, in fact, a centerpiece of antique creation stories, and it connects us to the archetypal substructure, a foundational human experience from which all of the ancient cultures arose. It's here that we encounter the so-called separation of heaven and earth. The words are all too familiar, but nothing close to an
And Satan was fighting Michael, and Satan lost. That was probably the point of separation that was recorded by the ancients.
Explanation or even an accurate use of words has ever appeared in scholarly studies of this theme. We've offered a testable explanation in our historical reconstruction. Based on the earliest astronomical traditions, it begins with an ancient gathering of planets close to the Earth. We've called this planetary assembly the polar configuration, and our claim is that the early cultures recorded its distinctive forms with every tool available to them, long before a language of stable planetary motions was even possible. Given the specificity of our visual reconstruction, it can be readily tested against a vast cross-cultural consensus. The cosmic mountain or pillar consistently meant the resting place of a visible power remembered the world over as the Creator, the figure named also as a primeval sun and identified in the early astronomical traditions as the planet Saturn. But in the prior historic context, the monumental cultures knew these powers simply as the ruling gods.
Okay.
So as we've seen, the Egyptian priests could declare, "The great God lives, fixed in the middle of the sky upon his support." And this central power Atum could announce with perfect consistency, "I am raised aloft on my perch above yonder places of the abyss." In the original mythic context, the abyss meant the cosmic waters, the primeval ocean of Nu, the very waters penetrated by the cosmic pillar to give Atum both his resting place and his external form. In our reconstruction, it is the crescent arms of the pillar god, standing out in a critical phase of the polar configuration, that visually divided the great sphere of Saturn into upper and lower regions. By following that surprising conclusion, the ancient sources will never disappoint us. And so we find in this archaic symbolism the origins of the Atlas theme, a theme coming down to us in many variations. But here too, conventional treatments of the subject lack any content in actual experience. That's why the ground we've covered in earlier discourses is so essential. In the daily revolution of this crescent, we see the original form of the cosmic twins. Just as the twins to the left and right signified contrasting positions of the crescent in the daily cycle, so did the symbolism of above and below in the same cycle of an archaic day and night. Here we discovered the archetypal meaning of the Egyptian words Nater Ta, the divine land, God's land, designated as two lands, more accurately, the twin lands, since, as we should expect, this symbolism is inseparable from that of the cosmic twins we've also discussed. In this case, the emphasis is on the revolving crescent positions above and below in the daily cycle. In Egypt, the meaning of these opposing crescent positions was localized in the symbolism of Upper and Lower Egypt. The original inspiration lay not in terrestrial context, but in sacred cosmography, symbolically projected onto geography. The cosmic map of a holy land in the sky was the prototype, reflected in sacred temples, cities, and kingdoms on earth.
Yeah, ancient Macedonians had this cult towards the great mother goddess, and it actually follows from the Neolithic great mother. And look at that.
He's directing our attention back to the twin powers of heaven. The celestial model was by no means limited to Egypt. All mythic archetypes trace to a unified source, sometimes complex, but always leaving an imprint, a signature, a fundamental and lasting contribution to human thought and religious practices the world over.
Well, it produced great sin, to be honest. The religion created by men, no bueno.
For the Sumerians and Babylonians, the agent of the cosmic separation was the giant Enlil. In a fashion eerily similar to that of the Egyptian Shu, Enlil divided a primeval unity into two regions, one above, one below. The word for that unity was Anki, a combination of the very words for above and below, on the above and ki the below. As in the story of the pillar god Shu, the Sumerian priests declared that it was the pillar god Enlil that separated On and Ki. This curious theme is well worth following. How did it happen that in so many creation accounts the world over, a fabulous pillar arises to separate an original unity into upper and lower divisions? Such memories coming down to us from every corner of the ancient world can only reinforce our conclusion that the mythic archetypes originated in an unfamiliar world, virtually no connection whatsoever to the celestial environment we experience today.
Look at
In
that.
all of this, a key consideration must be driven.
That's the whole point, you see? That's how the ancients would have seen it on the left here. Right? So you got the Saturn behind, but only the crescent underneath is lit up. Then you have Venus, possibly even Mars, in front of Venus.
Home. The ancient star worshippers did not just see a giant sphere in the heavens above them. They did not just see a heaven-reaching column appearing to hold that sphere aloft. The polar configuration had a central definition, including the vertical column's universal link to a revolving crescent. Follow today's common assumptions, and the entire idea of such a concrete global theme is preposterous. And yet, as we explore the ancient context, letting words mean what they say, the implications become ever more clear.
This guy's good.
Numerous mythic traditions say that from primeval chaos, a pillar arose to separate a created world into upper and lower divisions. By following the ancient stories of this cosmic pillar, we are led invariably and perhaps surprisingly to another archetype called the beginning of time. In our previous episode, we noted the role of the Egyptian pillar god Shu, whose upraised arms separated the all-encompassing primeval unity Atum into regions above and below. Across the land of Egypt, the creation texts identify the event as the Zep Tepi, the first time, when the gods inaugurated the beginning of time. We also observed this idea attached to the Sumerian and Babylonian god Enlil, called the Great Mountain, or Pillar of the Sky. Like the Egyptian Shu, Enlil divided a pre-existing unity into two regions, one above, one below. The word for that original unity was Anki, a combination of the very words for above and below, On and Ki.
Zechariah Sitchin, I think, from this kind of dry notion of above and below, derived the notion that this translates as those whom from heaven to earth came. But it simply says the above and the below, up, down. Well, it could mean that, because otherwise, what would it mean? The Bible says well, not the Bible. Well, the kingship was lowered on earth. What does that mean? All right, and Satan fell. All right.
A remarkable counterpart to the story of the Egyptian Shu. And every New Year, the Babylonian calendrical rituals looked back to this event as the beginning of time. By comparing the ancient traditions, we discover a complex of connected themes. The mythic archetypes include undifferentiated, watery chaos in the beginning, emergence of a cosmic pillar from these untamed celestial waters, identity of this pillar with the first activity of a cosmic warrior, role of this pillar god in separating primeval formlessness into visible regions above and below, role of a revolving crescent in the polar opposition of these two regions, a central star around which the crescent revolved, and the beginning of timekeeping in these very events. In our reconstruction, we relate this story directly to
There it is, like back in antiquity, back tens of thousands of years, if not hundreds. Humans saw this, and the archetype that we're seeing that was shown on ancient artifacts is this. In other words, we're much closer to the people depicted this as archetypes in symbolism, myths, and religion than those people were to this event, which is way back in the past.
Emergence of the polar configuration, a pillar arising along the Earth axis and identified with the first activity of the planet Mars. A central star at the summit identified as the planet Venus. And an illuminated crescent on the planet Saturn, this crescent visually revolving around the central star as the Earth rotated on its axis. Once recognized, the consequent mythic archetypes are as impossible to deny as they are impossible to explain through natural phenomena occurring today. From this new perspective, the arrival of the revolving crescent and the polar opposition of that crescent in the daily cycle meant exactly the same thing as the primeval differentiation of day and night. The subject is the first timepiece in the sky. And as we expand our field of view, the details of these archetypes and their connections to each other become ever more clear. Chinese traditions declared that in the beginning, heaven and earth, meaning the regions above and below, were joined together like a chicken's egg, but later separated. More particularly, the Yukagir described the upper region of the egg as a prominent arc with the ends turned down, while depicting the lower region as a prominent arc with the ends turned up. That depiction offers a surprising agreement with the reconstruction we've presented here, with no plausible explanation in currently observed phenomena. In the Chinese silk manuscript, it was the ancestral Pangu who separated the original unity into above and below, using his own body as a pillar to force apart the two regions. Cross-cultural investigation confirms this unique archetype, the role of a cosmic pillar, something never seen in our own time, to a universally remembered event. For the Vietnamese, it was the ancestral giant Kong who separated above and below, placing a pillar between the two.
Again?
Japanese creation accounts say that an original unified sphere called Enyo was divided into two parts, In and Yo. These twin powers were born from formlessness or chaos at the beginning of time, emerging as opposites around a central axial column. This column, named Ame no Tokotachi no Makoto, was the heavenly august pillar, or the heavenly eternally standing deity. Japanese creation mythology identifies the pillar god as the prop supporting heaven and separating heaven and earth. In later variations on the story, the two divisions were popularized and artistically stylized as the dualities yin and yang. In Hindu creation accounts, it was the prototypical warrior Indra who divided the original monad into regions above and below, the god himself standing as a pillar to hold the separation in place. In later times, Vedic astronomers had good reason to name the celestial pole as the pole of Indra, honoring Indra as the god who propped up heaven from earth at the beginning of time. The beginning of time. The language is remarkably consistent. Based on the archetypal context, we can say with utmost confidence that the words mean literally, before which no timekeeping was possible. We see the same memories across the South Pacific, where a great warrior, the son of heaven, is said to have divided an undifferentiated world into the primal pair. For example, the Maori of New Zealand recounted how the legendary warrior Tain, called the prop of heaven, separated an original unity into the first parents, Ranganui and Papatuanuku. The Maori remember this event as the emergence of light and dark. Darkness was made manifest, and so was the light, from a primeval haze or chaos at the beginning of time. And so the Hawaiian myths make clear that the original male and female powers named Ao and Po first appeared within the primeval waters at the beginning of time. This was when the Creator God separated Ao and Po, bringing the first day and night and making possible the world as we know it. The global repetitions of the theme are nearly endless. Like the Egyptian warrior Shu and the Mesopotamian warrior Enlil, the Maya warrior Tepu is said to have first separated above and below, typically mistranslated as the separation of heaven and earth. The Mosatine tribes of Bolivia recall a huge serpent taking the form of a pillar to hold apart two regions above and below, while the New Hebrides version says it was an eel that rose pillar-like from the primeval chaos to divide an original formless power into divisions above and below. But again, the translators render above and below as heaven and earth. Adding a somewhat comical texture is the North American warrior trickster Coyote, said to have been present at the creation, to have raised a great mountain, and even said to have helped in the separation of heaven and earth. This universal idea deserves much greater attention from students of the ancient languages and cultures. An entire complex of mythology traces to the activity of a revolving crescent above a cosmic pillar, taking us back to the earliest ideas of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. This collective memory could not be accidental. The revolving crescent was the decisive agent in the separation of above and below, since its revolution was the archaic cycle of day and night, as the polar configuration grew bright, then dimmed. Here was the universal beginning of timekeeping, well before the counting of months or years under the present arrangement of the sky. Such memories, coming down to us from every corner of the ancient world, can only reinforce our conclusion that the mythic archetypes originated in an unfamiliar world. As we explore the ancient context, letting words mean what they say, the implications become ever more clear. The global archetypes would not even be possible without the visible, towering forms anciently revered on every habitable continent.
Makes sense.
In these discourses, we propose that our Earth was formerly joined in a close congregation of planets, unlike anything observed today. Based on converging evidence globally, we can name the gathered bodies and identify an extraordinary correspondence between celestial events as seen from Earth and a massive outpouring of myths and symbols, all inseparably linked to the rapid rise of the ancient civilizations. In the final analysis, the only reason to accept or even to consider the reconstruction presented here is predictive ability. If the claimed events occurred, would we reasonably expect the unique narratives and sacred forms coming down to us as worldwide or archetypal content? Our overriding advantage in this respect is specificity. Since none of the concrete patterns revealed to us are predictable under today's common assumptions, not a single one. And yet, all are concretely and specifically predictable in the light of the reconstructed polar configuration. With this episode, we will begin enumerating the polar configuration's predictive ability in broader terms to lay the groundwork for the episodes to follow. The history of recorded human thought began with the myth-making epoch. Enigmatic symbols and magical practices told a story of creation, catastrophe, and regeneration of the world. Of course, the greatest mystery of all is the very existence of the mythic archetypes or common themes. We can count them by the hundreds. Why did every ancient culture declare that the sky changed, or that towering gods once ruled the world, then went away? Such mysteries invariably direct our attention to deeper and progressively more specific questions. Why did the world's first astronomers so consistently name the great gods as planets? What was the meaning of the so-called Great Conjunction or perfect?
That was a great question. Why the name of the gods corresponded with each planet?
Perfect conjunction of planets said to have marked the beginning of time. And not only that, the planet Saturn as a primeval sun. How did the planet Venus earn its worldwide identity as the mother goddess? Or the planet Mars, its global reputation as a great warrior? And what was the nature of the world-altering catastrophe said to have ended this celebrated epoch? Like hundreds of other mythic archetypes, such themes never make sense when referred to our present sky. Always they speak for things not seen in our own time. How did this disconnection occur? We can follow the archetypes across all of human
That's Mars.
history as associated art and mythic imagery, sacred narratives, and countless magical practices take us back to a lost age of gods and wonders. What was the human experience that provoked this ground floor human memory? Reconstructing the ancient experience requires systematic cross-cultural comparison. That is how we come to recognize different myths and symbols pointing back to the same events, all occurring in the earliest remembered time. Within this framework, it's only to be expected that an urgent collective memory would grow fragmented and confused across the centuries. Towering forms in the sky progressively lost their cosmic dimensions to become legendary ancestors of those telling the stories. Even the most powerful memories slowly gave way to localization, every tribal community on Earth declaring its possession of the original story. In this way, each regional culture could cling to a proclaimed lineage of divinely ordained kings, of world-conquering warriors, and radiant mother figures. Competitive claims of this sort lie at the heart of all localized mythic rhetoric. One effect amongst many was the incessant drive towards regional expansion through wars of conquest. Always the so-called Holy War was animated by a perceived divine mission descending from the gods themselves. This universal fact will become a key in our analysis of the warrior-hero theme. But there's more to this historic pattern. All of the broadly distributed archetypes bear identifiable relationships to remembered cosmic events. To appreciate the impact on humanity, the events themselves must be brought fully into the light of day. In our own time, historians and comparative students of religion can only explain world mythology as a carnival of pre-scientific ignorance. The specialists just assume that they understand what our early ancestors did not understand. But that explanation ignores hundreds of global patterns that would not even be possible in the absence of extraordinary natural events. The truth is that expertise will lead nowhere in the absence of understanding. The great myths arose in an age of planetary instability and cosmic violence, including close approaches of planets and earth-shaking electrical exchanges between planets. The conclusion in these discourses is that our world, our sky, has not always been the stable referent we experience today. The events that inspired a transformation of human consciousness were cosmic. These events are not occurring now. Hence, it is futile to look for answers in the appearance of the sky today. The present is not the key to the past. Allow for another vantage point and everything will make sense. But of course, a new vantage point requires that common assumptions be suspended to allow the tests of predictability. Of the hundreds of archetypes we've previously named, how many would be expected under today's assumptions? Not a single one. Would you expect the ancient stories of a former central luminary or primeval sun different from the body we call sun today? Would you expect the preposterous location of that body at the celestial pole, or expect the ludicrous identity of that very luminary with the remote planet Saturn? Our advantage is that every tenet in this reconstruction carries explicit, testable, and inescapable implications. Once named, the archetypes leap out at us. And as the archetypes are named, so are the implied relationships to other named archetypes. This fundamental unity, the ground floor of the human experience, is for us the acid test, drawing us into a critical examination of the causative events without which no archetypes could even exist. The goal is to identify the unified substructure of human memory. The process starts by naming the cross-cultural themes and allowing the implications to shine through. If indeed a common memory lurks within the historical record, the historical detective must first distinguish between the archetype and its localized expressions. Always keep in mind that the ancient tools of remembering invariably became agents of forgetfulness as well. That's because no local symbol, no mythic fragment, no magical reenactment could even begin to capture the full integrity of the original experience. No particular myth could possibly lead to any reliable conclusions as to things actually seen in the sky. The truth is that regional storytelling always fostered more forgetfulness than remembering. And yet, through systematic cross-cultural comparison, something deeper will reveal itself, a dependable integrity hidden in the underlying points of agreement, where an astonishing archetypal accord begins to shine through. In fact, every logical conclusion to be discussed in these discourses will follow simply and directly from three indisputable facts. Firstly, no archetype follows logically from any natural events observed today. Secondly, all archetypes are provably connected to each other. No isolated archetypes exist. And thirdly, a unified explanation is available to us if we allow the archetypes to speak for natural events not occurring today. We have named the celestial provocation as the polar configuration. By giving attention to the impact of these gathered planets on human imagination, all of the recurrent themes become witnesses to a story told around the world, and that means hundreds of archetypes hiding in plain sight.
Celestial bodies, look how they look from Earth's perspective.
The planet Venus, our closest planetary neighbor and the brightest star in the sky. Poets the world over have long considered Venus as a celestial symbol of charm and enchantment, the morning star transitioning to evening star, then back to morning star. But more ancient traditions about the planet run much deeper, with enigmas at every turn. Tales of wonder and terror attached to Venus seem entirely out of place in our tranquil heavens. Within the common theoretical frameworks today, there's just no room for the extraordinary sky-altering events once remembered around the world. That today's quiet planet could have formerly appeared as a great monster, a serpent or dragon attacking the Earth, may indeed seem too much to believe. And yet anomalies abound at every turn. Inexplicably, Venus is the only planet revered globally as a celestial symbol of the Mother Goddess, both a love goddess, a goddess of unrivaled radiance, and an angry goddess linked to earth-shaking and even world-ending catastrophe. This global contradiction must have an explanation, even if that explanation has been entirely missed in contemporary studies. Today, Venus moves on an orbit 67 million miles from the Sun, compared to Earth's distance from the Sun of 96 million miles. But many clues suggest a historic connection of Venus to the Earth, and these clues include the geometries of their motions today. Both the rotation of Venus and its revolution around the Sun exhibit a synchronous connection to Earth's motions. 5 Venus years equal 8 Earth years. While the usual planetary rotation is from west to east, Venus rotates in reverse, though remarkably slowly in contrast to the solar system norm. A Venus day or full rotation is longer than its year, the time it takes to complete a revolution around the Sun. But a Venus year almost exactly matches the timing of its closest approach to the Earth. And at its closest approach, Venus always shows virtually the same hemisphere to Earth. Synchronous or locked-in relationships of this sort, when they occur elsewhere in the solar system, are seen as evidence of a dynamic connection, either currently or in the past. Of course, astronomers have long believed that Venus evolved peacefully within its own enclave in the solar system for countless millions of years. Given its proximity to Earth, astronomers assumed the planet to be rather similar to our own, calling it Earth's sister planet, and speculating freely on the possibilities of life on Venus. But such speculations ended in the 1960s when probes of the planet stunned astronomers. The first continuous close-up look at Venus's surface came with the Magellan probe. When Magellan moved into orbit around the planet on August 10, 1990, its radar images revealed features as small as 100 meters across. Almost nothing in the earlier picture of Venus could withstand the impact of the discoveries that followed. The surface of Venus has been radically and catastrophically transformed by events yet to be comprehended. The probes revealed a superheated cauldron with surface temperatures averaging more than 460 degrees centigrade, or 900 degrees Fahrenheit. In describing the new profile of Venus, astronomers summoned images of a doomsday world. Massive clouds of sulfuric acid and carbon dioxide 20,000 meters high create an atmospheric pressure at the surface some 90 times that of the Earth. What has occurred in the evolutionary history of Venus to create a world never imagined prior to the space age? In this discourse and others to follow, we'll explore the astonishing accord between space-age surprises and the ancient descriptions of Venus.
Good.
The greatest surprise for science will lie in the global evidence that Venus formerly roamed the sky as a comet. In the language of ancient myths and symbols, the mother of all comets. And this is where we find one of the greatest challenges to today's theoretical assumptions about planetary history. Though Immanuel Velikovsky was not the first to notice the cometary images attached to Venus, it was his book Worlds in Collision, published in 1950,
I've heard
that
about
brought
this.
the issue to public attention with much greater force than any evidential fragments that preceded his best-selling book. Velikovsky noted many tales of disaster and upheaval in which the agent of destruction not only possessed comet-like attributes, but was named as the planet Venus. And so the anomalous comet-like features of Venus in world mythology became key pieces of a historical argument. He noted, for example, that in Mexican records, Venus was the smoking star, the very phrase natives employed for a comet. He found in both the Americas and the Near East a recurring association of Venus with celestial hair and with a celestial beard, two of the most common hieroglyphs for the comet in the ancient world. Another popular glyph for the comet was the serpent or dragon, a form taken by the planet Venus in virtually every land. And the same planet among the Egyptians, the Babylonians, and other races was called the flame or torch of heaven, a widespread symbol of a comet amongst ancient peoples. According to Velikovsky, the history of the comet Venus inspired one of the most powerful themes of ancient myth and ritual, a collective memory of catastrophe, global upheaval, earth-shaking battles in the sky, decimation of nations on Earth, an extended period of darkness, and the end of one world age and the birth of another. Having devoted decades to following the global evidence, I can confirm beyond any reasonable doubt that chroniclers the world over did indeed describe Venus as a comet. Not the planet that we observe on a predictable path today, from Egypt and Mesopotamia to northern Europe and Africa, from the Mediterranean to the South Pacific, from China to the Americas. The sky worshippers remembered the comet Venus with awe and terror. For those who've been following these discourses, we'll connect the global story of the comet Venus to our reconstruction of the polar configuration.
Let's go.
The universal fears of
Polar configuration. So that plasma that you see coming up, that's coming from Earth's poles, was coming from there.
comets, traced to the symbolic mother of all comets, without which the global accord could never have arisen in the first place. Why did the appearance of a comet signify the death of a great king? Why, more specifically, was it claimed to be the soul of a deceased king rising in the sky? Our goal will be to show that the myth of the great comet is the story of the radiant star that animated the polar configuration as the central eye, heart, and soul of the primeval sun. The subsequent fate of that star is indeed the story of the great comet. In all of the discourses in this series, one question has dominated. The question concerns the monumental civilizations that emerged so suddenly and unpredictably just a few thousand years ago. As scientists and historians delve into the early cultures from ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia to China and the Americas, the greatest challenge is almost never addressed. How do we explain the mythic archetypes, the global patterns? As we've noted repeatedly in this
He's going deep on this one.
series, not one of the early civilizations was free from this remarkable substructure of human thought. A profound sense of connection to the earliest remembered time, called the first time. a time of celestial
First tepe.
splendor when visible gods ruled the heavens, a lost paradise or golden age on earth, a tower.
That was pre-sin, pre-fall, pre-Adamic fall.
Temple or city or kingdom in the sky, a celestial Heliopolis, Sumer, or Jerusalem, a model in heaven to inspire construction of sacred dwellings on earth. A cosmic mountain rising along the world axis as if to support the luminous dwelling of the gods. A primeval sun god at the summit, not the body we call sun today, but a power claimed to have ruled the sky in a former age of gods and wonders. Why did Greek chroniclers so consistently identify the celestial founder of the Golden Age as Kronos, the Latin planet god Saturn? And for what unearthly reason would Greek astronomers have also named this very power as Helios, the sun? It is all preposterous. And yet the collective memories still tug at us, calling us to remember, pointing to patterns of historical fact that challenge every common opinion today about the past. The archetypes are the permanent backdrop to every civilization on Earth. We know that all of the early cultures obsessively feared a fiery serpent or dragon whose attack on the world brought humanity to the edge of extinction. And how strange that storytellers everywhere knew also the story of a cosmic warrior rising to subdue that very monster. These are not just loosely defined expressions of human anxiety. As we've seen, the details are concrete and the parallels are worldwide. The pervasive theme of the attacking serpent or dragon must have an explanation. Mere accidents of human thought could never have achieved the global influence of this human memory. No intellectual mistake could be greater than ignoring this convergence of human memories. The remembered events are not occurring in our own time. Today's world, today's sky, could not have provoked a single mythic or symbolic archetype, and that's the heart of a profound mystery. The archetypal substructure exists and has been documented across hundreds of global themes. This can only mean that something fundamental and indispensable to scientific understanding has been overlooked. To follow this question into the heart of the ancient world, it's well worth considering one archetype in particular, taking us back to the first stirrings of the great civilizations. I'm referring here to the ancient mother goddess, in particular the polar opposites expressed in the goddess's underlying identity. How did a mythic archetype, a goddess revered as the source of life and light and feminine charm, come to display a darker aspect as a world-threatening monster, the prototype of the wicked queen? A goddess originally celebrated as the exemplary star, the beautiful queen of heaven. What could account for the transformation of that very goddess into a shrieking witch or hag whose wildly disordered, streaming hair stretched across the sky? Cross-cultural comparison has answered the question. The paradoxical opposites take us back to one and the same power in the heavens. The love goddess and the terrible goddess turn out to be not just one and the same mythic figure, but one and the same planet, the planet Venus. In fact, the only planet amongst 5 visible planets to be given a feminine identity. Don't believe in accidents. That paradox has never been resolved and will not go away. It requires something yet to be recognized in standard treatments of the mother goddess. Just consider. The horrifying Medusa figure was a classic symbol of terror. But Greek historians and poets knew that Medusa was originally a form of stunning beauty. That's the paradox in a nutshell. And it traces to the very beginnings of civilization, where in ancient Mesopotamia we observe the transformation of the Sumerian love goddess Inanna into a shrieking dragon attacking the world. The same transformation occurs in ancient Egypt in the story titled The Destruction of Mankind. Here we see the beautiful goddess Sekhmet transformed into the fiery, world-threatening Uraeus serpent. How are we to explain this ancient paradox? Such unsolved mysteries invite us to question our assumptions. And one assumption in particular has held students of planetary history in its grip for well over 100 years. That assumption began as a guess, and it remains just a guess across the 20th century and into the 21st century. The theoretical assumption proclaims, as today, so before. The present is the key to the past. Call it the uniformity principle. Nothing to see here. It just assumes that the positions and relative motions of the planets have remained constant for millions of years, even billions of years, some would say. Today, this uniformity principle is the greatest obstacle to discovery. It systematically precludes any understanding of our more ancient past. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, the uniformity principle deflects our attention away from the collective memories that drove the emergence of the early civilizations. No mistake could be more costly than to ignore the global consensus, the archetypal substructure beneath the surface details and contradictions of the archaic cultures. This substructure is a bedrock of cross-cultural agreement, and it requires us to consider events that are not occurring today. The uniformity principle cannot be valid in approaches to ancient history. Our purpose in this series is to show that every known mythic archetype finds its place in the emergence and catastrophic evolution of a
Did you catch that? Each of these
gathering of
symbols
planets
combined in
close to
one symbol represented each person. And that was, Venus as Semiramis, Nimrod's wife, Mars as Tammuz, and the Saturn himself, the background was Nimrod.
the Earth. No selective perception required. We've called this ancient planetary assembly the polar configuration. This gathering of planets was the centerpiece of the anciently remembered age of gods and wonders. Within this framework, the global imagery of the Mother Goddess connects us directly to the origins, the dynamic activity, and the ultimate fate of the Venus Goddess. One planet alone meets the acid test, drawing our attention to the electrically discharging sphere seen visually in front of and close to the center of a much larger sphere named in the astronomical traditions as the planet Saturn.
Bro.
And within the very same context, the Venus Goddess stood in a profound alignment with the smaller, darker, and reddish sphere named globally as the planet Mars, the prototype of the warrior hero. That's the Mother Goddess paradox that we will explore in the 2 episodes to follow. Did cultures the world over describe the planet Venus as a comet? This was the radical conclusion of Immanuel Velikovsky, author of the best-selling book Worlds in Collision in 1950. For Velikovsky, the comet-like features of Venus in world mythology became key pieces of a historical argument, and the strength of the argument was derived from inexplicable images attached to Venus throughout the ancient world. To a remarkable extent, ancient words or phrases for a comet were the very words or phrases describing the planet Venus in archaic astronomical traditions. For example, Velikovsky had observed that in Mexico, Venus was the smoking star, the very phrase natives employed for a comet. He found in both the Americas and the Near East a recurrent association of Venus with streaming celestial hair and with a celestial beard, 2 of the most common hieroglyphs for the comet in the ancient world. Another popular glyph for the comet was the serpent or dragon. a form taken by the Venus goddess in virtually every land. The same planet among the Egyptians and Babylonians and other races was called the flame or torch of heaven, a widespread symbol of a comet amongst ancient peoples. According to Velikovsky, the history of the Great Comet inspired one of the most powerful themes of ancient myth and symbolism. In mythic terms, the end of one world age and the birth of another. Such facts as these make clear to us that the history of the Great Comet inspired one of the most powerful themes in the ancient world, a compelling reason to revisit Velikovsky's work today. Identical images for Venus and for a comet around the world could not be accidental. And there's more, because Venus's cometary aspect cannot be separated from the planet's identity as the archetypal mother goddess. That means both a love goddess, a goddess of unrivaled radiance, and an angry goddess linked to earth-shaking catastrophe. The story of the comet Venus is not an isolated theme. It is intimately connected to other themes and to other planets. First and foremost, the planet Saturn, anciently celebrated as the primeval sun. The story of the comet Venus is the story of the primeval sun's radiant heart or soul departing from the god in the midst of a celestial crisis. What followed was the earth-shaking war of the planetary gods. When we see the universal story of the comet in terms of our reconstructed gathering of planets, the polar configuration, every symbol of Venus will fall into place as a reflection of the archetypal great comet. The story recounts what happened to the central star in the polar configuration, as instabilities disrupted the planetary alignment, and the displacement of Venus from its original central position came to be seen as the death or catastrophic weakening of the primeval sun, the overarching power we've identified as Saturn in the astronomical traditions. This was when his luminous heart and soul appeared in the sky as a flaming serpent or dragon, or as the raging or lamenting mother goddess, which means precisely the same thing.
Bit weird, isn't it?
The intensely memorable events that followed drove imagination in many competing directions. Those recounting the stories could not even speak of them without the required use of mythic symbols provoked by the experience itself. The shadow cast by these events and by their imaginative or mythic interpretations conditioned all collective practices at the dawn of civilization. In this sense, the emerging civilizations arose as a compendium of ritual repetition, symbolic repetition, holding these events front and center in the rites of kingship, the rites of marriages of kings, the imperatives of war and sacrifice, the explosion of monumental construction, and much, much more. It's only to be expected that the great comet archetype would extend to the perceived fates of kings and kingdoms, since the comet meant the death of the prototypical king, the primeval sun, the mythic father of kings. That was when darkness overtook the earth and the god's luminous heart or soul rose in the sky. Then the gods went to war, and one world age passed into another. So of course kings feared nothing more than the wispy first appearance of a comet. The reason for the superstition has never been adequately recognized or explained. The myths and symbols of comets trace directly to the story of the Great Comet, the prototype that gave the later symbols
Venus.
their range of meaning.
That he was talking about Venus, when Venus was joining the solar system per this theory.
Unpredictable comets wandering into view in later times could only produce more echoes of the archetypal theme, the mother of all comets. A fascinating demonstration of the substructure occurs in the symbolism attached to the death of Julius Caesar, where we see the soul of the emperor rising as a star. In his groundbreaking book on the Roman cult of Venus, the 20th century's leading authority on the subject, Robert Schilling, gathered references to Caesar's apotheosis. He observed a curious blend of two ideas. Caesar's heart-soul rose as a comet, but it also rose as the planet Venus. And he noticed that the two ideas were actually joined as one. The poet Ovid describes the soul as a flaming comet, but also carried aloft by Venus. In more than one instance, the soul itself is actually described as Venus. A curiosity indeed. It seems that the distinguished specialist was simply unaware of a larger connection, the global memory of Venus as a comet. A point ironically highlighted in the 16th century debate between Galileo and the priest Horatio Grassi. The priest had reminded Galileo that the ignorant masses could believe anything, even the popular idea that Venus was a comet. Of course, this is precisely why comparative study of the ancient comet Venus is so critical today. To engage this study properly, the subject must be opened up to the full range of symbols involved, even if on the surface the symbols appear disconnected. In numerous cases, different symbols pointing to the same experience are the key to discovery. To make this point clear, we will take up next an alternative mythic interpretation of Venus as the central radiant eye of the primeval sun. Amongst the most terrifying figures of Greek mythology were the monstrous Gorgons. The Gorgon idea emerged as an overarching symbol of terror wherever its influence reached. Most modern treatments of the subject imply that there were 3 Gorgons, but the historical evidence makes clear that only one was known more anciently, the Gorgo, one goddess with a threefold aspect. Today it's commonly recognized that the Gorgon triad was originally indistinguishable from another well-known triad called the Graeae, described as 3 goddesses sharing a single eye. That's a clue and surely no coincidence. In the popular telling of the Gorgon story, only one figure stands out, and that is the terrifying Medusa. Artists and poets depicted Medusa's disordered hair as a tangle of snakes. Well, that's a clue too, because the image of snaky locks is just too close to the wildly disheveled hair of the archetypal angry goddess. But what was meant by the goddess's threefold aspect? That root form is no accident either, no random turn in the evolution of mythic symbolism. It points directly back to the archetypal triangular form of the so-called triple goddess, discussed in previous discourses. Seen in its historical context, the image takes us back to the visual appearance of the planet Venus in the polar configuration, more specifically the emergence of the archaic goddess from the triangular seed of creation itself. To understand the theme, we need only envision Venus in its concrete, central relationship to the massive sphere of the primeval sun, meaning in the early astronomical traditions, the planet Saturn. In following the evolution of the goddess image over time, we find that lovely and terrible aspects of one mythic archetype were progressively transformed into 2 separately named personalities. By this evolutionary process occurring across many centuries, the triple goddess and her terrible aspect emerged as a quasi-independent symbol of fear and destruction. But when we trace the theme back to its origins, we meet Medusa's archaic connection to a far-famed personality, Athena, a connection now widely acknowledged in comparative studies. There is good reason why we see the head of Medusa in the center of the very aegis or shield with which Athena herself was so closely identified. Then suddenly Athena's critical role in the story makes perfect sense. When the poets declared that it was Athena who placed the Medusa head in the center of her own aegis, that helped to maintain a distinction of the goddess from her own terrible aspect. Let the friendly and unfriendly faces of the goddess stand in opposition to each other, as if they signified independent forces. Not surprisingly, we see the same Gorgon head in the center of the shield of Heracles, and in shield symbolism more generally. That is how the terrible goddess came to stand as the great protectress, placed in the service of the archetypal warrior hero. The same idea stands out in the placement of the Medusa head over the entrances to temples, underscoring the angry goddess's original function as protectress. As we've seen in earlier discourses, this was nothing else than the terrifying glory, or face of glory, celebrated as the great protectress amongst neighboring cultures, with precisely the same protective function. As should be expected, the tangled hair easily merged with other symbols of the planet Venus's cometary aspect. For instance, the improbably bearded form of the Gray, of which Medusa was a mere variant. The incongruous beard was an explicit ancient symbol for the comet. The most obvious parallels were the bearded Greek goddess Aphrodite and her counterpart, the bearded Latin Venus, Venus Barbata, conveying precisely the same meaning. Such images were part of the progressive separation of the goddess's ugly or terrifying aspect from her lovely aspect. As in all cases that we've previously explored, the explanation lies in the underlying identity of the mother goddess, tracing to a time before the personality split, as we've seen in all of the goddess's more archaic forms. One archetypal goddess, simultaneously displaying both the lovely and the terrible aspects in one story. And so the question, how significant is it that not a single word from specialists have ever been offered as a plausible explanation for the dilemma, either for the personality split in general or for the Medusa theme in particular? Not surprisingly, the legends declared that Medusa was originally a beautiful maiden, but Athena changed the Gorgo's lovely hair to frightful snakes. In words attributed to the warrior Perseus, the poet Ovid states, "Her beauty was far famed, and of all her charms her hair was lovely."
Athena did this to Venus, per the mythology, and those are the new gods coming from the Danaus or the Hellenes, settling the Balkans. They had a new version based on now the finished War in the Sky. So they had a new interpretation when they came at Dodona in nowadays Greece at the Mount of Olympus and met the Pelasgians. I mean, it just fits perfectly there in how that kind of shaped civilizations. So I believe they offered, the ancient Hellenes or the Danaus offered a new interpretation of ending of the war and who won. And so Athena, or belonging to the father, or Athens, that we know today, she came from Zeus's mind, right? From her father. She's a new generation. Hence, she battered Venus, or the Great Mother, the previous main god, which is the mother goddess, coming all from the Neolithic and before even, probably. Interesting.
Of course, that's the distinguishing attribute of the mother goddess herself. In fact, the separate fragments confirm everything we would expect to find. It was said that the Gorgon was beheaded because she had been willing, quote, to be compared with Athena in beauty. Athena, slighted by her own alter ego, one might say. And so the text reads, Athena, for fitting punishment, transformed the Gorgo's lovely hair to loathsome snakes. And now the goddess, to strike her foes with dread, upon her breastplate wears the snakes she made. Well, that's quite a giveaway of the original story. To preserve the more noble and revered aspects of Athena, the chroniclers set the goddess in opposition to her own terrible aspect. As we shall see in the discourses to follow, this was a pervasive strategy in ancient storytelling, aimed at preserving the integrity of one's own culture while linking the darker side of celebrated mythic personalities to their enemies, often their own cultural neighbors. From this habit, we can learn a lot about both the celestial events and the psychologies at work within the early cultures. The lovely and terrible goddess impacted human history up to a remarkable scale. In these discourses, we're following the origin and evolution of an ancient gathering of planets close to the Earth. The formation stretched across the ancient sky, but is no longer present. The planetary assembly was witnessed around the world, and amongst its evolutionary phases, we've listed a condition called the polar configuration. The defining feature of this phase was the alignment of the Earth's rotational axis to that of the gathered planets. Our review will require us to follow implications to their logical conclusions. We can call these the acid tests of the reconstruction, and these tests do not allow for contradictions at the foundational level. We've identified the gathered planets as the source of the mythic archetypes now documented within all of the well-developed early cultures. In their underlying integrity, these archetypes could not exist without the natural events that inspired them. The primary constituents of the polar configuration can be reliably named thanks to well-established astronomical traditions. The large sphere is the planet Saturn, the discharging star close to the center of Saturn is the planet Venus, and the smaller reddish sphere in front of Venus as the planet Mars. We've also briefly alluded to two subsequent phases. The phase of wandering, marked by instability, celestial conflict, and titanic wars of the gods. And then a further phase that we've titled the Ladder of Heaven, or alternately the backbone of the sky, which meant the ladder of heaven. It was the collapse of that final form that ended the myth-making epoch as the gods departed to become distant stars, more specifically the respective planets as we observe them today. Based on research begun decades ago, we've also suggested that another planet not seen in our illustrated phase here was Jupiter, hidden behind Saturn and only revealed when instability set in, bringing the collapse of the polar configuration.
Collapse of the big sign, yeah.
In the course of these presentations, we've emphasized certain principles of reasoning that are essential when working with evidence drawn from a massive ancient record. The protocol requires us to work with a variety of mythic interpretations, tracing back to the same underlying forms. Concrete events in the sky, lacking any counterpart in the sky we observe today, provoked a variety of mythic interpretations. And that is why common explanations of the global patterns, the archetypes, never worked. The unified archetypal substructure of human memory does not allow for contrivances. In our most recent discourse, we noted the connection of the famous Medusa story to the archetype of the angry goddess, which means the terrible aspect of the planet Venus in world mythology, even if in many lands the planetary connection was lost in the chaos and reorganization of the solar system that followed. The global pattern, the archetype, was not lost. And that archetype can be reconstructed through systematic comparative analysis. Our analysis linked the story directly to the visual departure of Venus from its original position. With this displacement, the planet was no longer seen as the central eye or radiant heart and soul of the universal sovereign, meaning Saturn, but as an Earth-threatening chaos monster. In this chaotic condition, the former symmetrical star-like discharge streamers of Venus acquired a wildly disordered appearance, as the unstable motions of the planet appeared to threaten the entire celestial order, including our Earth itself. How did it happen that the body we now observe as a tranquil planet moving on a predictable path could have inspired memories of terror throughout the ancient world? That question invariably leads us to the ancient language of the planet Venus as a comet. Hence the truth of the matter. A vast library of evidence flatly precludes common assumptions about the history of the solar system. Neither historians nor theoretical scientists can afford to ignore the implications. This is why the rules of cross-cultural investigation are essential. Separate fragments of evidence are effectively useless when disconnected from larger patterns. And as the larger patterns are brought to light, it is also essential that they be followed back to their first occurrences, where the records themselves are closest to the original human experience. The comparative approach is not just an option, it is mandatory. Wherever diverse cultures use different words, different symbols, and different sacred practices to describe or reenact the same extraordinary events, that means a critical principle too long overlooked is awaiting discovery. I've made the point often, but it deserves repetition. Of the 5 visible planets, ancient cultures the world over identified only Venus as the mother goddess. Reason itself will not permit us to ignore that converging shout to us from the ancient cultures. With this universal identity in front of us, we can begin exploring more fully the ancient imagery of the Mother Goddess, including and reaching far beyond her explicit cometary attributes in a phase of cosmic instability. The best place to begin will be the sacred texts of ancient Egypt, which have preserved the story in the most vivid and original details, enabling us to see a global connection to the ground floor of human experience from which all of the archetypes, hundreds of them, anciently arose. Throughout this video series, we've claimed that the origins of world mythology, ancient symbolism, and magical rites lie in human memories of extraordinary natural events. It was from the emerging commemorative practices that the ancient civilizations themselves arose. And so we've repeatedly emphasized that the reconstruction offered here is far too specific to allow us to make up stories or to make up explanations. The evidence will either be there in the unique detail that the reconstruction demands, or it will not be there. Our explanation lies in a congregation of planets gathered close to the Earth long before the rise of observational astronomy. And that means before any of these bodies were even named as planets. We've called this celestial formation the polar configuration, and we've identified many of its varying forms as electric discharge activity between these bodies. Extraordinary events in the sky provoked an explosion of human imagination, now discoverable as story content within every ancient culture. In the course of these presentations, it should also become clear that no archetype, no global theme, could ever be explained by natural events in our own time. Things occurring today provide no reference whatsoever. The impact of this human experience requires that we follow the instincts of a detective, noting things too consistently out of place. And we must never forget that the more unusual the detail, the more compelling is the improbable convergence of testimony. Our claim is that the link of the mythic archetypes to the evolution of the polar configuration requires that we uncover the concrete reference beneath the imaginative symbols. Amongst the cross-cultural points of agreement is the repeated identity of the mother goddess as the planet Venus. This identity is not just worth following, it is a window to a mind-altering human experience, a story that reverberated through history for thousands of years. The paradoxical identity of the mother goddess with life itself, her role as the great protectress, but also as a world destroyer, can only be explained at the level of concrete origins beneath that symbolism. The discharged streamers of Venus, an effusion of mythic power and glory, were the animating life of heaven, seen in mythic terms as the luminous heart and soul of the universal power we've identified as Saturn. But the connection runs in two directions, since the discharging sphere of Venus was also interpreted as the protective shield of the warrior god named as Mars, who occupied the impenetrable spot, as if protected from the sky-darkening clouds or celestial armies of chaos. When the heavens fell into disorder, the sky itself became a mythic battlefield. Swarms of debris, seen as rebelling hordes, appeared to overtake the world. It was in this context that the most active and spectacular form of the goddess emerged, affecting every ancient culture's ideas about the meaning of war, conquest, and magical defense. But was the goddess a divine weapon launched against rebelling powers? Or was she herself the provocation, the feared destroyer of cosmic order? Human imagination would stand in competition for millennia, but more fundamental than the interpretation was the underlying event, and our purpose here is to see the events through the lens of global patterns. Ironically, it is the competing interpretations that confirm both the patterns and the events that provoked them. Confirmation comes wherever, without the underlying event, the global patterns would not be conceivable, not even be possible. In the presence of the goddess's visible power, enemies were scattered. Dark clouds of chaos gave way to a blast of fire and light. The rebelling hordes of heaven fled from its onslaught. One of the most dramatic illustrations of this archetypal theme is the Egyptian legend called the destruction of mankind. The myth says that the primeval sun god Ra had grown aged and perhaps a bit weary of humanity. It recounts how in that remote time the children of Ra had rebelled against the god. In response to the rebellion, Ra sent out his powerful eye to take vengeance on a disrespectful world. The agent of the conflagration that followed was the goddess Sekhmet. Not just a goddess, Sekhmet was the far-famed eye of Ra, the Utshit, the giver of life and the great protectress, the very heart and soul of the primeval sun himself. Enigmatically, Sekhmet also possessed both a leonine and a serpentine form, a remarkable parallel to the Sumerian Venus goddess Inanna, who displayed the same forms in her role as the terrifying radiance in the center of the god On, the overarching ruler of the sky. This is no coincidence. These mythic forms reveal no relationship whatsoever to today's sky, but they are not accidental, not random, and they direct our attention to the archetype of the great comet, the human experience from which the female comet archetype descended. The comet has the eye, heart, and soul of a great king. Comet is a star with disordered hair or leonine mane. Comet is a cosmic serpent. And the comet as a sign or an agent of world destruction. And so we find a remarkable juxtaposition of comet attributes in the titles of the Egyptian goddess Sekhmet, called the beautiful eye of the primeval sun. She was the great flame, or flaming one, the destroyer by fire, the destroyer of rebellions, the ruler of serpents, and the ruler of lions. Strangely, all of the well-documented goddesses in Egypt were like
Ruler of lions, kind of like King of Kings.
Sekhmet, called the Eye of Ra, suggesting an underlying identity entirely outside natural experience today. And no goddess figure in ancient Egypt tells this story of the sun god's eye more vividly than Sekhmet, whose very name derives from the root kim, signifying a blast of glory or majesty, the essential character of the eye goddess. Sekhmet entered the conflagration displaying a trail of fire. The texts say, "Behold me, men and gods, I have come into being as the Lady of Glorious Appearings. My flame is behind me." It is a flame which drives away on its account. The tip of its flame crosses the land from the sky. No one at all can approach her. The streams behind her are flames of fire. In fact, the Egyptian traditions constitute a remarkable parallel to Sumerian descriptions of a world in fear and trembling at the tempestuous radiance of Inanna, identified as Venus. Precisely the same way, Sekhmet appeared as a flame of fire in her tempest, instilling terror on earth and threatening to destroy the world. "I am mistress of the flame," the goddess announces. "The fear of me is in their hearts, and the awe of me is in their hearts." The flame makes his enemies fall. It is a flame moving before the wind of the sky to the end of the earth.
All right.
Surely it is no coincidence that the great flame in heaven, taking the form of a fiery serpent, found its symbolic place on the crown of kings in Egypt, exactly as we've seen in ancient Mesopotamia. It was the headgear of the king that reflected the protective role of the explosive majesty most dramatically. In later times, when Egyptian armies confronted foreign nations, these peoples were seen as barbarians outside the gate. They were the terrestrial counterparts of the primeval chaos fiends. And so the king invariably called upon the shining majesty of Ra, remembering how the eye goddess in her rage had destroyed rebelling powers in the sky in former times. In considering this theme, the critical steps will require comparative analysis of an incontrovertible historical pattern. The ancient story of the goddess as the explosive glory of heaven was the story of the great comet. In this experience, we find the origins of the astronomical language and symbolism of comets around the world. There is no other explanation. And so, too, the attributes of the celestial glory are the defining attributes of the planet Venus as Mother Goddess. And as we continue our series, this truth can be verified in the astronomical lexicon of every well-documented culture in ancient times. In their essential details, the global story of the great comet is the story of the planet Venus. The ancient polar configuration. the most profound influence on early human history. A metamorphosing form in the sky, punctuated by instability, electrical outbursts, and episodic human terror. Our claim has been that the rise of the ancient civilizations themselves occurred in response to these events, under a compulsion to reenact celestial dramas that forever altered humanity's sense of identity. Here was the original source of the mythic archetypes and all of the mysterious symbols and magical rites passed down from generation to generation for thousands of years. The subject of this investigation does not allow for selective perception. Rather, it draws upon the totality of human experience through the myth-making epoch, an explosion of storytelling, inexplicable images carved on stone, and monumental construction, all declaring that towering gods formerly ruled the sky, though only for a time, before they departed. And so we've called this historical narrative the one story told around the world. The story assures us that within human memory the sky changed radically, and thereby every critical turn in the story becomes an invitation to hear the ancient witnesses, look past the regional novelties, observe the human experience and its connection to the natural events that provoked all of the underlying patterns, the archetypes. But how could we draw reliable conclusions from transparently unreliable witnesses? The question is clear enough, but finding the answer requires that we follow ancient testimony back to its global convergence on critical details, even when those details seem too preposterous to believe. This simple requirement, fundamental to all reliable detective work, assures us that the archetypes could not be accidental or random. In unison, the archetypes express the coherent substructure of an extraordinary ancient experience. Of course, no single archetype on its own, even if hiding in plain sight, could give you reasons to believe a story. The truth is that virtually all archetypes are too preposterous to believe. Chaos monsters attacking the world, dying gods, heroes consorting with legendary goddesses, and mountains, towers, and stairways to heaven. And yet, for an investigator of this mystery, it is the preposterous details coming down to us as a cross-cultural consensus that offer a new understanding, with no room for compromise on fundamental ground rules. As the archetypes are brought to light, just two questions must be asked. Would this archetype be expected under the influence of things in our sky today? And would this archetype be expected under the ancient experience of the polar configuration? By posing just two questions, it becomes clear that the underlying integrity of the archetypes could not be accidental. The archetypes can be counted by the hundreds, and each stands in a predictable relationship to a universal substructure or cross-cultural agreement. And that is our advantage, specificity, with no ambiguity as to the answers anciently given. There is a full explanation for all of the mythic archetypes, but that explanation lies in planetary formations once visible to humans the world over. Planets close to Earth, embedded in spectacular plasma formations between these gathered bodies and animated by electric discharge. I've called these the acid tests because they don't allow us to simply invent explanations. In prior episodes of this series, we've alluded to many story elements in our reconstruction. An ancient sun god, the exemplary ruler of the sky before the present sun, a primeval sun, central sun, motionless sun, polar sun, all named in the early astronomical traditions as a planet, Saturn, celebrated as the original creator and king of the world, the mythic founder of the kingship rites. Saturn at a preposterous location at the celestial pole. Saturn bringing to humankind the legendary golden age. And so too the ancient memory of Saturn displaced or overthrown in an episode of world-altering catastrophe or cast down to the opposite end of the world axis. Don't believe in coincidence. The underlying integrity of this story could not be accidental. Of course, the story of Saturn is just the opening chapter. It's the totality of the ancient planetary connections that will drive the message home. That includes the vast range of images attached to the planet Venus. What natural experience could have inspired the global archetype of Venus as Mother Goddess? Why the mysterious identity of the goddess as animating eye, heart, or soul of the primeval sun? And what was meant by the goddess's departure from that elevated position, or the so-called terrible aspect of the goddess that followed? Such questions are only the beginning. What of the planet Mars, so often said to have been born from the womb of the goddess, then earning a reputation as the pillar of the sky, and still later emerging as the cosmic warrior, even the divine weapon of the gods, the cosmic thunderbolt? Again, ask yourself whether any standard approaches to human history or to the origins of ancient thought has ever produced a compelling explanation for a single archetype, just one archetype amongst the hundreds that have now been identified. Under today's theoretical assumptions, a global accord would be inconceivable. But our objective in this series is to demonstrate the direct relationship of every archetype to the emergence and evolution of the polar configuration. No ambiguities and no rationalizations required. Though first impressions may see only a collection of random absurdities, the widespread patterns are not random. And the proof of this lies in hundreds of archetypes all lining up coherently to present a unified story under the most stringent demands of three-dimensional perspective. At each stage in the metamorphosis of the configuration, the changes in the relative positions of the interacting bodies require highly specific changes in appearance. In such acid tests, it is the demands of logical consistency and three-dimensional perspective that must guide us at each stage. And with this guidance, we can be confident that rational ground rules for assessing human testimony can direct us to definitive conclusions. In previous episodes of this series, we've claimed that the first civilizations arose under the influence of extraordinary natural events. But these events, including phases of overwhelming catastrophe, remain largely unrecognized today. In supporting this extraordinary claim, we've offered global evidence suggesting an ancient gathering of planets close to Earth. We've called this planetary assembly the polar configuration due to its alignment with the rotational axis of the Earth. Documentation supporting a reconstruction of the configuration comes down to us from cultures the world over. We see the events reflected in the rise of kingship, the emergence of the first writing systems, of monumental construction, and the great national wars of expansion, all explicitly linked to intensely remembered events when planets appeared to battle in the sky as clouds of celestial debris shrouded the Earth, and great volumes of dust and rock fell upon our planet. We've called this human memory the one story told around the world. The universal tradition takes us back to an age of planetary gods and celestial wonders, the universal source of the world's archetypal myths and symbols. And so we've claimed that there could be no archetypes without the implied global experience. It's the common experience that gives the archetypes both their context and their concrete detail the world over. We now know that since the dawn of the great civilizations, memories of fear-inspiring catastrophe pervaded all of human activity. An outpouring of imagination and pervasive fear, doomsday anxiety, showed its face in every culture that followed. And above all else, this body of magical and ritual practices sought to deflect or to forestall the return of remembered catastrophe. Our historical argument is drawn upon evidence left by the great civilizations, starting with the appearance of formal writing systems. But there is also a layer of prehistoric evidence, and this archaeological layer can help us to visualize celestial events before the appearance of any written records. This prehistoric evidence directs our attention to the human response in the very midst of a deadly threat. In other words, contemporaneous with earth-threatening catastrophe. Here we're not dealing just with a compulsion to reenact celestial dramas, but something more immediate and more urgent. Refuge. Human beings either seeking shelter from anticipated catastrophe or desperate to find refuge from catastrophe already underway. Seen from this more radical perspective, today's common picture of a prehistoric world takes on nuances that archaeologists appear to have missed. Critical lines of evidence converge to suggest a human retreat into caves, or alternately to find refuge in crudely constructed stone enclosures, or earthen mounds, as defenses against rock and celestial debris falling from the sky. To appreciate the perspective offered here, we need only allow for the implied urgency, and that's a consideration virtually never included in standard treatments of prehistory. What was on the minds of those who entered caves, or raised giant stone dolmens or great mounds of earth, seemingly with no clear motive to account for them? How much of this activity might be explained in terms of perilous events once occurring in the sky but not occurring today? Such events could only mean that the present cannot be the key to the past, and a fundamental premise of modern science must be corrected. From this vantage point, certain features stand out. The urgency is endlessly reflected in the crude architecture of the dolmens that punctuate ancient landscapes across the British Isles and Northern Europe, all the way to Russia and Korea, and even with counterparts in North America. Such structures are readily distinguished from the more ambitious and more obviously skillful architecture that followed with the emergence of the great civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia. How significant, for example, are the repeated indications of interruption and incompletion? In numerous instances, as if a massive undertaking was begun but ended in tragedy and was never finished. That should not surprise us if these undertakings occurred in the presence of the very catastrophe that all ancient communities most feared. In many instances, a partial, seemingly irrational raised roof draws our attention, entirely out of proportion to its support. Indeed, the massive stone roofs are commonly the most imposing structure. Has any historian or archaeologist ever explained this human investment across a vast region? When you see the undertaking as a defense against falling rock, the mystery of human motivation instantly vanishes. Other considerations also enter this picture. The apparent role of celestial catastrophe will not permit us to ignore the implied context of extended deprivation and nostalgia, as we can see in the conditions portrayed on the walls of caves. In the catastrophic environment suggested here, what might the paintings of human hunting and abundant game be telling us? A familiar phrase from American Indian tradition comes to mind, the happy hunting ground. Not an illogical phrase if the actual condition was one of profound nostalgia. Were the artist painting on walls of caves and rocky cliffs, nostalgically remembering something lost? Psychologists know well that in a state of deep deprivation, the mind will become increasingly obsessed with what is missing or what has been taken away. That point was made explicit in an army experiment years ago. When placed on a narrow diet of nothing but potatoes, those participating in the experiment began to dream nostalgically of the missing diet, perhaps a steak dinner, their favorite beer, or apple pie. In this case, we have two different themes: humans retreating to caves and their nostalgic remembrances, both pointing in precisely the same direction. Look again at the prehistoric paintings on the cave walls across Europe and beyond, the hunting scenes and the abundant game. Could we entertain the possibility that these scenes actually celebrate a community life no longer available but actively remembered? Why such pervasive nostalgia if nothing had been taken away by natural events? With that concrete question in front of us, additional questions arise. Is it possible to identify such an experience in the thematic links of the cave dwellers to the emerging civilizations that followed? Is there a connection to the explosion of monumental construction launched almost simultaneously in Egypt and Mesopotamia? Since Napoleon first stood in awe of the wonder of the Great Pyramid, scientific commentary was taken over by questions of technology and architecture. But have we missed something? In the conditions of the time, what was the role of human urgency or protection? In particular, the protection of kings and royal families. And how might our picture of the ancient world, the rise of kingship itself, or the explosion of military conquests be changed when seen in the light of an earth-threatening sky? Answering such questions will require us to see the ancient monuments in a new light. And the Great Pyramid becomes something more than an enchanting monument standing out on the ancient landscape, more than just a dark chamber for practicing magical rites or recording hieroglyphic prayers to the gods, or charting a sky map to guide the mythic ascent of deceased kings. Of course, such motives are well documented, but could there be more to the story? What was on the minds of those who invested vast resources in urgent construction? In the following episodes, we'll consider a new perspective, one in which all of the ancient motives converge as a testament to remembered catastrophe. In particular, a desperation for protection against unpredictable rains of rocky debris from the sky, to which we shall add a noteworthy emphasis on the planet repeatedly named as the source of falling stone, the planet Mars. Myths and symbols of a prehistoric mother goddess have long enchanted investigators of the early cultures. One reason for the fascination is the connection of the goddess to the earliest forms of artistic expression. In their creation of revered goddess figurines, what were these prehistoric artists depicting, and why? Examples are abundant, but where are the plausible explanations? From the vantage point developed in this video series, might we discern something concretely experienced, but unknown today? Amongst all of the prehistoric goddess images, the most attention has gone to the so-called Venus of Willendorf, categorized as Venus de Autophagia, the obese Venus. Along with thousands of counterparts, this unusual theme poses a profound question as to Earth's prehistoric environment. Beginning in the 1960s with the first stirrings of a so-called goddess movement, researchers began to selectively interpret the prehistoric theme, seeing it in the context of envisioned matriarchal cultures. But then, almost as quickly, that interpretation receded into the background. In the mid-1970s, we proposed that a close congregation of planets, Earth included, moved through a cloud of dust and gas, obscuring the background stars while highlighting the unique appearance of the gathered bodies as a living form. We suggested that this occurred long before any such body was named as a planet and prior to the quasi-stable polar configuration we've discussed at length in this series. What was seen in that prehistoric epoch was not static, but produced a complex of spiraling aspects, toruses, and other features, often including a tapering extension of gas and dust descending toward the horizon of observers on Earth. This earlier, more primitive goddess form presents a radical contrast to everything we've learned about the later evolution of the polar configuration. In this phase, we see little or nothing to suggest direct solar illumination of the planetary participants. In fact, no indication of any cosmic cycle whatsoever, and certainly nothing comparable to the revolving crescent in the polar configuration. Few, if any, radial discharge phenomena either. In seeking to comprehend the prehistoric goddess, we begin with one inescapable assumption, that widespread patterns must have an explanation in human experience, even if that explanation has yet to be recognized. Of course, it would be futile to search for reference in the sky today. The sky has changed. But the ancient motives can be revealed by simply following the evidence for an unusual condition. For example, what does the unnaturally rotund goddess aspect signify? Why are arms and feet so frequently missing? Or why the often conical or tapering lower limbs? Or the occasionally tapering upper aspect? Or why the unnaturally spherical, often featureless heads, or other spherical aspects of the goddess? As to the uncertainty of theoretical interpretations, we offer a tip of the hat to Wikipedia. The original cultural meaning and purpose of these artifacts is not known, Wikipedia states. That is indeed the truth of the matter. Anthropologists and archaeologists cannot explain the motive or the cultural context for the prehistoric goddess images. But one recurrent pattern in particular gives us a window into the prehistoric condition. Certain unique features of the archaic goddess remind us of the toroidal forms we previously observed in the evolution of the polar configuration. In the prehistoric setting, this aspect shows up almost endlessly, often appearing as a pair of unnaturally spherical eyes, somewhat similar to the eye mask we've highlighted in earlier discussions. But we also see these unnatural eyes accompanied by other toroidal forms, seemingly with no natural place or function. In the prehistoric period, this toroidal aspect stands out most prominently in its connection to folded arms enclosing the breasts of the goddess, sometimes from above and sometimes from below. This variable form deserves a closer look. By all appearances, the observer standing on Earth experienced something close to an edge-on view into a toroidal configuration. But it seems that librations in that position highlighted an alternating appearance of the goddess's arms above or below the toroidal boundary. In both cases, it's the repeated connections of the goddess's arms to the toroidal enclosure that give us the enigmatic but most familiar pose of the goddess. Ambiguities in our first impressions will generally disappear under closer investigation. In the most common view of the goddess figurine, an observer may not immediately realize that the goddess's arms fold over her breasts, and yet that position becomes undeniable when seen from a side view of the goddess. More frequently, we see the arms of the goddess in the lower position. The conclusion standing out above all other details is the implied toroidal form of the goddess's arms, marking out and highlighting the enclosed space. Once discerned, that general pattern becomes predictable across a large number of prehistoric goddess forms, and in many cases it will be impossible to miss. Our proposed answer to the mystery of the prehistoric goddess requires nothing more than a medium of gas and dust and charged particles through which planets formerly moved. Planets immersed in this dusty plasma cloud, engaged in continuous electrical transactions, the one requirement to produce all the formations anciently observed, including the entire variety we've already documented in this series. But can the connection between the Paleolithic goddess and planets be named more precisely? Clearly, the modern scholars who first named the ancient goddess images as Venus figurines had no idea as to how appropriate that language might become as these artifacts began to draw more scholarly attention. And of course, the Paleolithic goddess images arose long before the polar configuration we've described, and that means long before the astronomical identification of the goddess with a particular planet, Venus. And yet this undisputed fact still leaves the question as to why, with the rise of planetary astronomy in ancient times, the newly trained observers of the sky consistently identified the mother goddess with just one planet, Venus, and no other. So we cannot afford to overlook the question of cause and effect. Throughout this series of discourses, we've suggested that none of the mythic archetypes, not a single one, could have arisen under the present sky. The sky changed. But now, just as clearly, we can see that the earliest prehistoric forms of a mother goddess also point back to an unfamiliar sky in Paleolithic times. This evidence deserves to be followed with the same attention to detail that we've applied to the later polar configuration. Is it possible to reconstruct an ancient experience before the emergence of the polar configuration? What changes in Earth's celestial environment must have occurred after the dominance of this archaic goddess form to inspire the great civilizations, or the consequent explosion of writing, storytelling, the emergence of kings and kingship rights, all with little or no precedent in the earlier epoch? On their own, the prehistoric goddess images do not sufficiently clarify the cultural context, and many details seem to appear out of nowhere. And yet the recurring similarities are suggestive of something much more profound than mere absurdity or outlandish caricature of female forms. These curiosities are an open invitation to systematic comparative investigation, as we shall further document in our next episode. This video will continue our exploration of the ancient mother goddess, whose first appearance we have traced back to prehistoric times. It seems that with the emergence of the more advanced civilizations, including the monumental cultures of Egypt and Mesopotamia, the primeval goddess faded into the background and often disappeared altogether. In the prehistoric epoch, there are no written histories to guide us, but there are abundant figurines suggesting a mysterious feminine form with certain unique features. In this earliest phase, we cannot say whether regional wars were commonplace or largely absent. Hunting weapons seem more obvious than preparations for battle. We see little or no evidence of the warrior kings that appeared so forcefully with the emergence of the great civilizations that followed. Unsettled issues include the origins and meaning of sacrifice and details concerning death and burial. Nevertheless, based on the totality of evidence explored in this series, a variety of conclusions can be drawn as to the prehistoric environment from which the first images of a mother goddess emerged. For context, our approach to the Mother Goddess draws upon a larger investigation into the wide-ranging cross-cultural archetypes of the antique world. These most fundamental structures of ancient thought, at the dawn of civilization, invite us to work backward in time to envision a world before historical chronicles and before systematic timekeeping. That means prior to the first appearance of what we've called the polar configuration, a grand assembly of planets gathered close to Earth and moving through a dusty plasma cloud. Our claim has been that it was this polar configuration, by its impact on human imagination, that catalyzed the emergence of symbols and sacred practices that defined early civilizations. And so, one puzzle drawing our attention is the dramatic break that appears to separate the prehistoric phase from the subsequent emergence of developed languages and commemorative practices. It seems that this gap largely excludes the evidential linkage or chain of events that one might have hoped to follow across the divide from prehistoric to historical evidence, and yet several tantalizing clues invite us to ask new questions. Across the prehistoric period, we observe two evolutionary phases in the emergence of a mother goddess image. Both are explicable, but only within the framework of a radical challenge to common thinking. The earliest evidence includes a first female form that historians and archaeologists still struggle to understand, a distinctly rotund goddess type called Steatopygia. As we should expect, there is a frequent and inexplicable suggestion of sphericity in the prominent features of the primitive goddess. And we're not surprised that the spherical head or face of the goddess often appears featureless, or that the lower limbs are frequently presented as a tapering column, exactly as we've seen in our review of the margin contribution to the polar configuration. For us, this places an exclamation point to an inescapable conclusion throughout these investigations, that something unrelated to any human cause provoked the extraordinary depictions of the mythic gods. In the emergence of the prehistoric goddess idea, there was a second phase as well. That phase involved a distinctive torus or enclosure, displaying a visual opening and closing as the celestial bodies moved through space. This effect can be compared to the variable positions we previously observed in the symbolic arms wrapped around the margins of the enclosure and appearing in competing positions above and below the breasts of the goddess. In fact, the changing visual plane of the torus adds additional clarity to that ancient concept. And for us, that means a new chapter in this investigation, a chapter we could not have written just a year ago. A critical breakthrough comes from an anciently depicted, clearly toroidal womb of goddess figures where no human attribute will explain the unique form presented. The ring displayed by this Olmec goddess is a useful starting point, and it is not unique. Even more striking is the Moshe counterpart many centuries earlier, in which the torus is sufficiently clear to identify that form as the archetype, whereby the associated female figure simply gives the context of the mythic interpretation. Ironically, it's another example from the opposite side of the world that offers the most striking counterpart to the South American goddess images. In this case, not only supporting a radically new interpretation of the goddess, but confirming the direct connection to the visual opening and closing of the envisioned torus. We refer here to the enigmatic images of the mythic figure named Sheela-na-gig. Her widely distributed images, appropriately called grotesques, are found across much of Europe, most prominently in Ireland, and enigmatically most often placed close to the entrances to churches. The general consensus is that they had a protective function, similar to that of the Medusa head placed above temple entrances in other parts of the world. But beyond that agreement, scholars are still looking for an explanation of the deeply entrenched idea. In the case of Shile-Nagig, the connection to the visual opening and closing of a torus is simply too strong to be disputed, as we see most emphatically in these examples from Ireland, and most notably in the instance shown here, where the toroidal form stands out as nothing else than a torus seen from a position orthogonal to the plane of the torus itself, and thus in the fully open position visually. What then was the relationship of the opening and closing of the Shile-Nagig torus to the eye mask form also displayed by this very figure? That's a form with which we are already familiar, and the answer comes from the ancient habit of juxtaposing alternative mythic interpretations of underlying archetypal forms. In this instance, the question has already been answered by our earlier analysis of the polar configuration, where the twin eyes of the eye mask image are explained by the unique forms of electric discharge in the plasma laboratory, as we learned from the leading plasma scientist Anthony Peratt over a dozen years ago. Seen from the edge-on vantage point, the observer looked directly into the twin aspects on opposite sides of the tubular torus itself. As viewers who followed our presentations will remember, in the famous stickman image so frequently seen carved on stone globally, twin dots on opposite sides of the figure resulted from a field of view directly into the tubular plasma discharge form. But now there is more to consider, since the visual opening and closing of the torus would affect both the symbolism of the twin eyes and the toroidal void so frequently and enigmatically enclosed by the twin arms of the ancient goddess. Both the twin eyes and the toroidal folded arms direct our attention back to distinctive aspects of the root forms. Eyes closed, or eyes fully open with a direct view into the tubular torus that constituted the visual boundary of the enclosure, to which we add the tapering lower limbs of the goddess as the formation evolved. Our claim is that the full complex of symbolic patterns belongs to a unified substructure tracing back to prehistoric times. And lastly, it's not just in the ancient images and not just in laboratory experiments that we observe the twin aspects of the plasma torus. Today we see similar geometry in the toroidal form configured around the south pole of the planet Venus, though obviously diminished and degraded as planets moved around the sun in increasing isolation. The original dynamics of the primitive goddess archetype can still be discerned, and that's a synchronicity well worth investigating, one polar vortex producing twin vortices, just as our study of the eye mask revealed, and just as laboratory experiments have so conclusively demonstrated, and now just as we have observed in the prehistoric mother goddess. Such considerations as these can only add crucial support for an extraordinary human experience, confirming once again that the ancient world was indeed a very different place.
And there you have it. That was amazing, wasn't it? Like being able to see a reconstruction of the ancient sky. That's something awesome, man. That was really good. It made me think. Made me really think about like how deep that archetype in history may is. Well, anyhow, I'll catch you in the next one. See you later.